The first time Constance May Whitfield crawled beneath her own cabin, she was chasing a tin of lard that had slipped through a gap in the floorboards. It was February 1847, and the Montana Territory winter had already claimed two of her neighbors, one to pneumonia, one to simple starvation when his root cellar froze solid and everything inside turned to ice. She had been a widow for 8 months. 8 months since Josiah had gone out to fell timber on a Tuesday morning, kissed her forehead the way he always did, scratched Copper behind the ears, and told Rosie he would bring her back a pine cone for her collection. He never came home alive. The tree had twisted as it fell, caught by a gust of wind that came from nowhere, and Josiah had been standing in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment. The men who brought his body back could not look her in the eyes. They laid him on the kitchen table, still warm, still looking like he might wake up and ask what all the fuss was about. Constance had washed him herself, dressed him in his Sunday clothes, sat beside him through the night while Rosie slept, and Copper whined at the door, confused about why his master would not get up. They buried him on the hill behind the cabin, in ground that Constance broke with his own pickaxe, because the earth was still frozen and no one else was there to do it. She had made the coffin herself, too, from boards Josiah had cut and stacked in the barn. It was rough work, ugly work, but it held together. It carried him down into the dark. Now she was alone with a 5-year-old daughter who still sometimes called for Papa in her sleep, a border collie who still waited by the door every evening for a man who would never walk through it again, and a raised floor cabin that Josiah had built 18 inches off the frozen ground. Good drainage, he had said, keeps the rot out. What it also did was create a dark, cold void beneath their home, a space that trapped every winter wind that blew across the Montana plains like a knife seeking flesh. Constance lowered herself through the access hatch near the back porch, lantern in one hand, cursing softly as her skirts caught on a nail. The crawl space smelled of frozen earth and old wood. She could see the lard tin glinting about 6 feet ahead, resting against one of the stone piers that held the cabin aloft. She crawled forward on hands and knees, the cold seeping through her wool dress, her breath forming small clouds in the lantern light. And then she stopped. Something was different here. She held perfectly still, trying to understand what her body was telling her. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. The wind cut across the open prairie at 30 miles per hour, turning exposed skin white in minutes. She had wrapped herself in 3 layers just to make the short journey from the cabin door to the access hatch. But here, beneath the floor, something unexpected touched her face. Warmth. Not much. Not summer warmth or even spring warmth. But compared to the brutal cold she had just escaped, this space was noticeably, measurably warmer. She could feel it on her cheeks, on her bare hands, on every exposed inch of skin. Constance May Whitfield held very still, lantern raised, breath suspended, and let herself feel. Heat was seeping down through the floorboards above her. The cook stove burned hot all day and all night, had to for cooking and for keeping little Rosie alive in this frozen wasteland. That heat warmed the cabin floor, and some of it was escaping down here. The earth below her hands was not frozen, insulated by the snow piled around the foundation, protected from the wind by the cabin walls extending down to ground level. The soil had retained some warmth from autumn. It was cold, yes, but not frozen solid like the ground outside. Even the air was different, trapped, still, not subject to the wind that stole heat from everything it touched. She stayed there for a long time, forgetting the lard tin entirely, her mind racing through possibilities she had never considered before. What if this space was not wasted? What if it could be made into something? The thought struck her with the force of revelation. What if she could grow food down here? Constance May Whitfield had grown up in Cornwall, on the southwestern tip of England, where her grandmother Eleanor had maintained a forcing house behind their stone cottage. A simple structure, really. Glass panels set into wooden frames, angled to catch the weak winter sun, positioned against a south-facing wall that radiated stored heat through the long, dark months. In Cornwall, Eleanor had grown lettuce in January, spinach in February, radishes that emerged crisp and peppery while snow still covered the garden beds outside. She had kept their family fed through winters that killed livestock and broke strong men, all because she understood something that her neighbors had forgotten. It is not magic, her grandmother had told her once, kneeling beside young Constance in the humid warmth of the forcing house, while sleet rattled against the glass above them. It is simply understanding how heat works, how light works, how plants work. The same sun that barely warms your face outside is trapped in here, collected, concentrated. The same earth that freezes solid out there stays warm in here, because we have given it a blanket of glass. Constance had been 12 years old then, still young enough to believe that her grandmother could do anything, still innocent enough to think that knowledge was something everyone valued and respected. She had helped her grandmother plant seeds in neat rows, watching the old woman's gnarled hands move with practiced precision. She had watered the seedlings with water warmed on the cottage stove, learning the proper temperature by touch because thermometers were expensive and unnecessary when you had experienced fingers. She had harvested greens that tasted like summer in the dead of winter, and she had not understood then what a miracle that was. Her grandmother had died the year before Constance left for America. 93 years old, sharp-minded until the end, eating salad from her forcing house even on her last day. She had pressed her journal into Constance's hands, a leather-bound book filled with decades of observations, measurements, and techniques. "Take this," she had said. "The old ways are being forgotten. Someone must remember them." Constance had brought the journal to America, had carried it across the Atlantic in a trunk that held everything she owned, had read it by candlelight in the cramped cabin of the ship, then in the covered wagon that carried her and Josiah west, then in this cabin in Montana where she now sat, alone, wondering if any of that knowledge could save her and her daughter. She had not thought about those lessons in years. Survival on the frontier left little time for reminiscence. Every day was a battle against weather and isolation, and the thousand small disasters that could turn a difficult life into an impossible one. But now, crouched in the dark space beneath her cabin, feeling warmth where warmth should not exist, every lesson came flooding back. Heat rises, yes, but it also spreads. It seeks equilibrium. It flows from hot to cold until balance is achieved. Her cook stove pumped heat into the cabin floor. That heat had to go somewhere. Some of it rose through the room above. Some of it spread outward through the floor joists, and some of it, she now realized, seeped downward into this forgotten space. If she could trap that heat, contain it, maybe even enhance it with glass to capture sunlight. The idea was audacious. It was probably impossible. A greenhouse in winter in Montana, built by a widow with barely enough money for spring seed, and a daughter who needed her mother to be practical, not foolish. But Constance May Whitfield had learned something in the 8 months since Josiah's death. Practical could kill you just as dead as foolish. Practical was what the Patterson family had been when they built their root cellar exactly the way everyone else built root cellars. And now Mr. Patterson was dead because his practical root cellar had frozen solid. Sometimes survival required something more than practical. Sometimes it required the courage to be called crazy. She spent 2 weeks thinking it through before she told anyone, not even Rosie. Constance had learned that announcing half-formed plans invited either pity or mockery, and she could afford neither. Instead, she observed, she measured, she planned. Every morning, she lowered a thermometer through a gap in the floorboards and recorded the temperature beneath the cabin. Every evening, she did it again. She noted how the temperature rose when she cooked on the stove, how it fell during the coldest nights, how it remained remarkably stable compared to the wild swings of the air outside. The numbers told a story. When the outside temperature dropped to 20 below zero, the crawl space stayed at 25 above. When the outside warmed to 10 above during a brief thaw, the crawl space rose to nearly 40. The earth beneath the cabin was acting as a buffer, storing heat during warmer periods and releasing it during cold snaps. A 45-degree difference, sometimes more. That was not nothing. That was the difference between water freezing and water staying liquid. That was the difference between seeds dying and seeds surviving. But it was not enough. She needed temperatures in the 50s or 60s to actually grow vegetables. She needed more heat capture, more insulation, more solar gain. She needed glass. The solution came to her while paging through a dog-eared Sears and Roebuck catalog that Harriet Coleman, the Trading Post manager's wife, had lent her. Between advertisements for cast iron stoves and patent medicines, she found what she needed: greenhouse glass cold frames. The description read, wooden frames 3 feet by 6 feet with glazed sash tops hinged for ventilation. Protects tender plants from frost. Essential for the progressive farmer. $4.50 each. They were designed to sit on the ground, creating miniature greenhouses for starting seeds in early spring. But Constance saw them differently. 6 of these frames, installed vertically as windows along the south-facing opening of her crawl space, would create a glass wall. The hinge tops could open for ventilation when needed. The wooden frames would be easier to install than loose panes of glass. 6 frames at $4.50 each, $27. She went to her strongbox that night after Rosie was asleep. Inside was everything left from selling Josiah's tools: his good cross-cut saw, his chisels and planes, his broadaxe that he had brought from Pennsylvania and kept sharper than any blade she had ever known. $29.43. $27 for the glass frames would leave her with $2.43. Enough for seed. Maybe. Not enough for anything else. Not enough for emergencies. Not enough for failure. She sat at the rough-hewn table, lantern flickering, and did the arithmetic over and over, hoping the numbers would change. They never did. If she bought the glass and it did not work, she would have nothing. If she did not buy the glass and the winter continued like this, she might have nothing anyway. Rosie had been pale all winter. The child ate what Constance put in front of her: salt pork and cornmeal and dried beans. The same thing every day, because that was what they had. But Constance could see what the diet was doing. Rosie's skin had lost its color. Her eyes had lost their brightness. She tired easily and slept poorly, and had stopped asking for stories at bedtime because she did not have the energy to stay awake through them. Children needed fresh food. Everyone knew this. The old-timers called it spring sickness, the weakness that came from months without green vegetables. Some years, the Trading Post would get a shipment of preserved lemons in March, and mothers would pay outrageous prices for them because they knew in their bones that their children needed something that salt pork could not provide. But this was February. March was far away. The Trading Post had no lemons and would not have any for months. Constance looked at the money in her strongbox. She looked at Rosie, sleeping fitfully in the bed they shared. She made her decision. The order took 6 weeks to arrive, coming up the Missouri River by steamboat and then overland by freight wagon. When the wagon driver unloaded 6 wooden crates stamped fragile glass at the Trading Post, half the settlement gathered to watch. Constance had known this would happen. News traveled fast in small communities. Everyone already knew that the Whitfield widow had ordered something peculiar from the catalog, something expensive, something that made no sense to anyone who heard about it. Building a greenhouse, Mrs. Whitfield? The question came from Silas Brennan, who owned the only general store within 50 miles. He was a thick man with calculating eyes, the kind of man who always knew exactly what everything cost and what everyone owed him. He had been circling Constance's property since Josiah's death, making offers that were not quite low enough to be insulting, but never high enough to be fair. Her land had water, a spring that ran year-round, even in the worst droughts. Silas Brennan wanted that spring. Something like that, Constance answered, examining the crates for damage. Lot of money for a maybe, Silas observed. His voice carried across the trading post porch, meant to be heard by everyone present. His tone suggested concern, but his eyes glittered with something else. Thaddeus Hartwell, a carpenter who had built half the structures in the territory, stepped closer to examine the crates. He was a lean man with sawdust permanently embedded in the creases of his skin, and he had strong opinions about construction that he was never shy about sharing. Cold frames, he said, reading the label, meant to sit on the ground, protect seedlings in spring. He looked at Constance with something between confusion and pity. You know it is February, Mrs. Whitfield. I know what month it is. Glass will not survive a Montana winter, Thaddeus continued. First hard freeze, it cracks. First heavy snow, it breaks under the weight. He shook his head. I have been building things in this territory for 30 years. Glass and winter do not mix. A woman's voice cut through the crowd. Prudence Whitmore, who considered herself the social arbiter of the settlement, though no one had given her that title. Poor thing, Prudence said, loudly enough to be heard by everyone. She has clearly lost her senses from grief. Someone should speak to her, for her own good. The words landed like stones. Constance felt them strike, felt the heat rise in her face, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned this too, in the 8 months since becoming a widow. Showing emotion only gave people more ammunition. At the back of the crowd, Constance noticed a young woman watching with curious eyes rather than mocking ones. Verity Brennan, Silas's daughter-in-law, newly married and newly pregnant, her hand resting on her barely visible belly. She did not laugh. She did not whisper to her neighbors. She simply watched. Near the porch steps, old Jedediah Moss leaned on his walking stick and said nothing at all. He was 78 years old, had survived more Montana winters than anyone in the settlement, and rarely offered opinions unless asked. Boone Tanner, young and loud and perpetually looking for entertainment, pushed to the front of the crowd. $5 says she is begging Silas to buy her land before March. Anyone want to take that bet? Laughter rippled through the crowd. I will take that bet, said a calm voice. Everyone turned. Harriet Coleman, the trading post manager's wife, stepped forward. She was 55 years old, silver-haired, practical in all things and respected by everyone who knew her. I will take that bet, Harriet repeated, and I will double it. $10 says Mrs. Whitfield makes it through winter without selling anything to anyone. The laughter stopped. Betting against Harriet Coleman was usually a losing proposition. The woman had an uncanny sense for which way the wind would blow. Boone Tanner's confidence flickered, but he was too young and too proud to back down in front of a crowd. Done, he said. $10. Harriet nodded once, then turned to Constance. Need help loading those crates? Please, Constance said. And thank you. They loaded the 6 crates into Constance's wagon together, working in silence while the crowd slowly dispersed. When the last crate was secured, Harriet spoke quietly. I do not know what you are planning, but I know desperation when I see it, and that is not what I see in your eyes. She paused. My grandmother had a forcing house in Pennsylvania. Grew greens all winter. People thought she was a witch. Constance looked at her. What happened to her? Harriet smiled. She lived to be 93 and ate salad every day of her life. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Have you ever had to take a risk that everyone around you thought was crazy? Share your experience and stay with us, because what happens next changed not just Constance's life, but the lives of everyone in that settlement. The ride home took 2 hours. Copper ran alongside the wagon, tongue lolling, occasionally darting off to investigate a scent before racing back to his position beside the front wheel. He had done this since he was a puppy, since the day Constance had found him abandoned beside the trail, too small and too weak to keep up with whatever wagon train had left him behind. That was 3 years ago. Copper was full grown now, a handsome border collie with one blue eye and one brown, fiercely loyal to Constance and Rosie both. Rosie was waiting on the porch when the wagon crested the last hill, her small figure wrapped in a too large shawl that had belonged to Josiah. She waved with both arms, nearly losing the shawl in her enthusiasm. "Are they here? Did they break?" Constance pulled the wagon up beside the cabin and climbed down, her back aching from the long ride. "They are here, and we will know soon if they broke." They opened the first crate together, Constance prying nails carefully to preserve the wood, while Rosie bounced with barely contained excitement. Inside, nested in straw, was a beautiful thing. A wooden frame 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, made from pine and painted white. The top third was a glazed sash, 12 panes of glass, each one intact, set in a hinge frame that opened and closed smoothly on brass hinges. Rosie reached out one careful finger to touch the glass. "It is so smooth." "It is. And expensive. We will be very careful with it." They spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking all 6 frames. By some miracle of careful shipping or answered prayer, only one pane was cracked, and even that was a clean break that could be puttied and still function. That night, after Rosie was asleep and Copper had settled into his spot beside the stove, Constance sat at the table and drew plans. She was not an engineer. She had never built anything more complicated than a chicken coop, but Josiah had taught her to think through a project before starting. Measure twice, cut once, plan for failure, build for strength. The south-facing opening beneath the cabin was roughly 16 feet wide and 18 inches tall from ground level to the bottom of the floor joists. Her 6 cold frames, stood on end, would be too tall. Each frame was 6 feet long, and the opening was only 18 inches high. She would have to install them at an angle, tilted to catch maximum sunlight, the bottom edges resting on the ground, the tops leaning against the floor joists, creating a sloped glass wall that followed the angle of the winter sun. She sketched it out on the back of an old flour sack, erasing and redrawing until the angles looked right. Then she did the arithmetic, calculating how much heat might be captured, how much light might penetrate, how warm the space might become if everything worked the way she hoped. The numbers were uncertain. There were too many variables she could not account for, but the principle was sound. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "The same sun that barely warms your face outside is trapped in here, collected, concentrated." She would trap the sun. She would collect the heat. She would concentrate every advantage this difficult space could offer. And she would grow food in the dead of winter, under her own house, because the alternative was watching her daughter fade away one colorless day at a time. The work began on a Monday morning in early April, when the worst of the winter cold had finally loosened its grip, and the snow had melted enough to expose the south side of the cabin foundation. Constance had spent the previous weeks preparing, gathering materials, sharpening tools, studying the angles of the sun as it tracked across the sky, noting where it rose and where it set, calculating the precise tilt needed to capture maximum light. Now she stood in the mud beside her cabin, 6 glass frames lined up on sawhorses, and looked at the dark opening that led to the space beneath her floor. Copper sat nearby, watching her with the patient attention he gave to everything she did. Rosie was inside, strictly forbidden from coming near the work area until the dangerous parts were finished. Constance took a breath, picked up her hammer and saw, and began. The first task was to frame the opening properly. The 18-inch gap between ground and floor joists was currently just open air, bordered on three sides by the cabin's log walls, but completely exposed to the south. She needed to create a proper wall structure to mount the glass frames against. She cut pine 2x4s to length using Josiah's cross-cut saw, a tool she had learned to sharpen herself over the long winter. The teeth bit into the wood with satisfying precision, throwing a spray of sawdust that settled on her sleeves and in her hair. She created vertical studs every 3 feet along the opening, measuring carefully with a knotted string she had marked at 12-inch intervals. Each stud needed to be exactly plumb, or the whole structure would twist under the weight of the glass. She sank the bottom of each stud 6 inches into the earth, tamping the soil tight with a wooden mallet. The tops she nailed to the underside of the floor, joists with hand-forged nails, each one representing a calculation. Would it hold? Could she afford it? What happened if she guessed wrong? The work was slow and exhausting. By the end of the first day, she had set only 4 studs. Her hands were blistered in 3 places, the skin raw and weeping from gripping the hammer handle for hours on end. Her shoulders ached from the unfamiliar angles of overhead work. Muscles she did not know she had screaming in protest. She had hit her thumb with the hammer twice, and both times she had bitten back words that a lady was not supposed to know, tasting blood where she had bitten her lip. That night, she could barely lift her arms to brush her hair. Her back had seized into a solid knot of pain. Her fingers were so swollen she could not make a fist. Rosie had watched her struggle to eat dinner, small face creased with worry. "Mama, you are hurt." "I am tired," Constance said, forcing a smile. "There is a difference. Tomorrow will be easier." It was not easier. The second day was worse. The blisters had opened, and every grip of the hammer sent fire through her palms. But she wrapped her hands in rags, gritted her teeth, and kept working. By the third day, something had changed. Her body had begun to adapt. The pain was still there, but it had become familiar, almost comfortable. Her swings had found a rhythm. Her measurements came faster. She was learning. Rosie brought her water at sunset, carefully navigating the mud and construction debris. "Mama, why are you building boxes?" Constance wiped sawdust from her forehead. "Because glass needs something strong to sit against. If we just hung it in the air, the wind would break it. But if we give it a strong frame, it can survive. The frame takes the stress. The glass just has to be glass." Rosie considered this. "Like how my doll needs me to hold her." Constance smiled despite her exhaustion. Exactly like that. On the 4th day, Thaddeus Hartwell rode out to the Whitfield claim. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the edge of the work area, sitting on his horse, watching Constance struggle to hold a cross beam in place while she tried to nail it with her other hand. "You are doing that wrong," he said. Constance's arms were shaking. The beam was slipping. She did not have breath to spare for conversation. Thaddeus dismounted, walked over, and held the beam steady without being asked. "Nail it," he said. She drove the nails home, 3 of them, securing the beam in place. Then she stepped back, breathing hard, and looked at the carpenter. "Thank you." Thaddeus examined her work with a critical eye. "Your studs are solid, good spacing, plumb enough." He ran his hand along the cross beam they had just installed. "This is not bad work for someone who has never framed a wall before." "How do you know I have never framed a wall before?" "Because your blisters are fresh and your hammer swing is uncertain." Thaddeus produced a tobacco pouch and began rolling a cigarette. Also, I have built every structure within 50 miles of here. If you had framed a wall before, I would know about it. Constance said nothing. She was too tired for verbal sparring. Thaddeus lit his cigarette and took a long drag. I came out here to tell you this will not work. Glass cannot survive what Montana will throw at it. Your frames will crack by December. By January, you will be trying to keep snow out of your crawl space instead of plants in. My grandmother grew vegetables all winter in Cornwall, with glass. In weather as harsh as this, Cornwall, Thaddeus said flatly, is not Montana. No, it is not. Constance picked up her hammer. But physics is physics. Heat is heat. Light is light. The principles do not change because you cross an ocean. Thaddeus watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head. I have seen every kind of fool project you can imagine, he said. Root cellars that flooded, barns that collapsed, houses that burned because someone got clever with a chimney. He took another drag on his cigarette. And I have never, not once, seen anyone try to build a greenhouse under their house. Then you have not seen everything. No, he agreed. I suppose I have not. He finished his cigarette in silence, watching her work. Then he mounted his horse. When it fails, he said, do not come crying to me about it. He rode away without looking back. Constance watched him go, then turned back to her work. Her hands were bleeding where the blisters had torn open. Her back felt like someone had spent the morning kicking it. She had 3 more studs to set before dark, and the clouds on the western horizon suggested rain was coming. She picked up her saw and kept working. By the end of April, the framing was complete. Constance stood back and examined what she had built. A proper wall structure, 16 feet wide and 18 inches tall, with vertical studs every 3 feet and horizontal cross pieces at 6 and 12 inches, creating a grid that would distribute the weight of the glass and resist the pressure of wind. It was not beautiful. The joints were rougher than a professional carpenter would have made them. Some of the studs were slightly off plumb, creating small irregularities that bothered her every time she looked at them. But it was strong. She had tested it by leaning her full weight against different sections, and nothing had moved. Now came the delicate part. The glass frames needed to be installed at a 30-degree angle, tilted back against the floor joists above, positioned to catch the maximum winter sunlight. Each frame weighed nearly 40 pounds. Lifting them into position, holding them steady while she secured them, would be the hardest part of the entire project. She started with the leftmost frame, working slowly and carefully. First, she positioned the bottom edge on a support board she had installed at ground level, creating a rest point so the frame would not slide. Then she tilted the frame up, letting its weight fall back against the floor joists above, and held it in place with one hand while she reached for the screws with the other. The frame slipped. She caught it, barely, her muscles screaming with the effort, and managed to lower it back down without breaking any glass. She stood there breathing hard, looking at the frame, and realized she could not do this alone. Harriet Coleman arrived the next morning, driving a wagon and bringing her husband's eldest son, a strapping young man named Marcus who did not ask questions. Constance had not asked for help. Harriet had simply appeared, as if she had known somehow that help would be needed. I used to help my grandmother, Harriet said by way of explanation. I know how this works. Between the 3 of them, the frames went up in a single day. Marcus lifted, Constance positioned, Harriet secured. Frame by frame, the glass wall took shape, angling back against the floor joists, catching the afternoon light in brilliant sheets. By sunset, all 6 frames were mounted. Constance stood in the mud, exhausted beyond words, and looked at what they had created. A wall of glass, 16 feet wide, tilting back at a 30-degree angle, framing the entrance to the space beneath her cabin. The hinged sash tops could still open for ventilation. The wooden frames were solid against the structure she had built. It was beautiful. "It is not finished," Harriet said, standing beside her. "You need to seal the gaps. Add thermal mass. Build growing beds, I know. But this is the hard part done." Harriet put a hand on Constance's shoulder. "My grandmother would have approved." Over the following weeks, Constance made improvements. She sealed the gaps between frames with oakum, the same tarred hemp fibers used to caulk ships, available at the trading post for a few cents a pound. The smell was terrible, like a fishing dock on a hot day, but the seal was perfect. She banked earth against the outside of the glass frames, creating an insulating berm that rose halfway up the lower panes. This would reduce heat loss through the base and help stabilize temperatures during cold snaps. She collected river stones, painted them black with lamp black mixed with linseed oil, and arranged them in wooden troughs beneath the glass. During the day, sunlight would warm these stones. At night, they would radiate that heat back into the space, evening out the temperature swings. Inside the crawl space, she built raised beds from scrap lumber, simple boxes, 2 feet wide and 6 feet long, arranged in rows on either side of the central walkway she had planned. Each box required careful construction. The sides had to be sturdy enough to hold soil weight, but she could not afford to waste wood. She filled the beds with careful layers. The bottom layer was 6 inches of dried manure she had ordered from a farming supply catalog. Aged and composted, it would slowly decompose and warm the soil from below. The smell when it arrived was extraordinary. Rosie wrinkled her nose dramatically. "That is nasty, Mama." "That is fertility," Constance corrected, though privately she agreed. "Plants love it. It is full of everything they need to grow: nitrogen, phosphorus, organic matter, and it generates heat as it breaks down, which is exactly what we need." Above the manure, she added prairie soil she had collected in autumn and stored in barrels. Rich, dark loam from a creek bottom where native grasses had grown for centuries. She mixed this with more composted material, creating a nutrient-rich growing medium. The final layer was 2 inches of fine soil mixed with sand for drainage and easier seed germination. Each bed steamed faintly in the cool air when she watered them with warm water from the stove. The decomposing manure was generating its own heat, just as the agricultural journal she had read had promised. Biology and physics working together. Everything connected. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever built something with your own hands that everyone said would fail? Have you ever felt that satisfaction of proving yourself right, not with words, but with results? Share your story in the comments below. And if you are new to this channel, hit that subscribe button now, because the best part of the story is still coming. The thermometer told a story. When Constance had first crawled beneath her cabin in February, the temperature in the crawl space had been around 25 degrees, 40 degrees warmer than the brutal cold outside, but still too cold for growing anything. Now, with the glass wall installed and the thermal mass in place, the readings were different. On a sunny day in early May, with outside temperatures in the low 40s, the greenhouse space reached 62 degrees. On a cloudy day, it dropped to 55. On the coldest night she measured, when frost covered the glass and ice formed in the water bucket on the porch, the greenhouse stayed at 49 degrees. Above freezing, always above freezing. It was not warm enough for tomatoes or peppers. It was not a tropical paradise, but it was warm enough for lettuce, for spinach, for radishes and carrots and hardy greens. It was warm enough for survival. The skeptics did not stop coming. Pastor Edmund Calloway arrived one afternoon, his black coat dusty from the ride, his expression grave with concern. "I have heard about your project," he said, standing at the edge of the work area and making no move to come closer. "Some in the congregation are troubled." "Troubled by what?" Calloway's fingers worried at the brim of his hat. "This knowledge you speak of. These techniques from the old country, some say it sounds like pagan wisdom. Constance set down the trowel she had been using to spread soil. My grandmother was a Methodist, she said evenly. She read her Bible every morning and attended church every Sunday until the day she died. The only thing she worshipped was the Lord. The only thing she taught me was how to pay attention to the world He created. Calloway shifted uncomfortably. Still, growing food in winter, it seems to go against the natural order. Perhaps there is a reason God gave us seasons. Constance looked at him for a long moment. Did God give you a coat, Pastor? I beg your pardon? Your coat. She gestured at the heavy wool garment he wore despite the mild spring weather. Did God create that coat? Or did men create it to protect themselves from the cold He created? Calloway had no answer for that. Go home, Pastor, Constance said gently. Pray for my success or my failure, whichever eases your conscience. But do not tell me that using my mind to survive is somehow ungodly. He left without another word. Dr. Cornelius Finch came a week later, bringing with him a leather satchel full of scientific instruments and an attitude of confident superiority. He was the only trained physician within 100 miles, a graduate of a medical college in Philadelphia, and he never let anyone forget either fact. I have heard about your experiment, he announced, ducking into the greenhouse space with a measuring tape and a thermometer of his own. From a purely scientific standpoint, I must tell you that your expectations are unfounded. Constance was transplanting seedlings and did not look up. Is that so? Heat transfer through wooden floorboards is inefficient. Solar gain through angled glass is minimal during winter months. Your thermal mass, he gestured at the black-painted stones, will lose heat faster than it can absorb it. Basic thermodynamics. And yet my thermometer says the temperature in here is 61 degrees, while the temperature outside is 43. Dr. Finch harumphed. Short-term readings are not reliable indicators of long-term performance. Wait until December, wait until January, your temperatures will crash and your plants will die. Constance finally looked up at him. What do you grow, doctor? I beg your pardon? In your garden. What do you grow? I do not garden. I am a physician. Constance nodded slowly. I see. So you have no practical experience with horticulture, no knowledge of growing conditions, no history of working with plants at all, but you are confident that my project will fail. I have a scientific education. Then your scientific education has a gap in it. She returned to her transplanting. Close the door on your way out. You are letting the heat escape. Not all visitors were hostile. Old Jedediah Moss came by in late May, walking slowly up the path with his gnarled walking stick tapping against the packed earth. He was the oldest man in the settlement, 78 years of hard living written in every line of his face, and he remembered things that others had forgotten. Constance helped him down the stairs into the greenhouse, steadying his arm as he navigated the final step. Jedediah stood in the center of the space, turning slowly, taking it all in, the glass wall glowing with afternoon light. The raised beds thick with green shoots, the black stones absorbing warmth, the smell of growing things mixing with the earthy scent of good soil. He said nothing for a long time. Finally, he lowered himself onto a stool Constance had placed near the beds for exactly this purpose, and let out a long breath. My grandmother had something like this, he said quietly. Back in Pennsylvania, before the war, she called it a pit house, half underground, glass roof, warmer than any room in the main house during winter. Constance knelt beside him. Did it work? Jedediah's eyes crinkled. Woman lived to be 94 years old and ate green salad every day of her life. People called her a witch because she looked 30 years younger than she was. He shook his head slowly. I forgot about that. Forgot about a lot of things. Old memories get buried under new ones. Do you remember how it was built? Some of it. Jedediah closed his eyes, reaching back through decades. South-facing, always south-facing. Glass angled to catch winter sun. Thick walls on north side. Sometimes earth-bermed. And stones. He opened his eyes. Black stones, like yours. To hold the heat. She said they were like a bank account. You make deposits during the day and withdrawals at night. Constance felt tears prick at her eyes. That is exactly what my grandmother said. Jedediah reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. The old ways always come back. People forget them, mock them, say they are backwards and primitive. Then hard times come, and suddenly everyone wants to remember what their grandmothers knew. He squeezed her hand once, then released it. You are doing a good thing here. Do not let the bastards grind you down. The first seeds went into the ground in late May. Tom Thumb lettuce, early round spinach, French breakfast radishes with their red and white tips, Nantes carrots, smaller and sweeter than the standard varieties, flat leaf parsley, chives that would come back year after year if she treated them right. Rosie helped with the planting, her small fingers surprisingly deft at spacing the tiny seeds. Not too deep, Constance instructed. Lettuce seeds need light to sprout. Just press them into the soil and cover them lightly. They worked together through the afternoon, filling each raised bed with careful rows. Copper lay near the entrance, his head resting on his paws, watching them with the patient attention he gave to everything his family did. By evening, 6 beds were planted, watered with water warmed on the stove, and waiting. Now what? Rosie asked. Now we wait, Constance said, and hope. The seeds germinated in 8 days. Constance had been checking twice daily, climbing down into the greenhouse each morning and evening with her lantern, recording temperatures, checking soil moisture, watching for any sign of life. On the morning of the 8th day, she held her lantern close to the lettuce bed and saw them, tiny green loops pushing up through the dark soil. Dozens of them, hundreds, each one a small miracle, a seed breaking open and reaching for the light. She called for Rosie immediately, and together they knelt beside the bed, watching the impossible happen. Is that lettuce? Rosie whispered. That is lettuce, Constance confirmed, and she heard the emotion in her own voice. We did it, Rosie. The seeds are growing. By winter, we will have food when no one else does. Rosie reached out one finger, stopping just before touching the delicate sprouts. Can I touch it? Very gently. The stem is delicate. Rosie touched a tiny plant with her fingertip, her expression solemn. It is soft. It is. And in a few weeks, if we take care of it, it will be big enough to eat. More germinated over the following days. The spinach came up in neat uniform rows. The radishes popped up fast, their cotyledons unfurling like tiny hands reaching for the filtered light. The carrots were slower, taking 12 days, but eventually appeared as delicate, ferny shoots. Constance thinned the lettuce on day 14, carefully pulling every other seedling to give the remaining plants room to grow. Can we eat these? Rosie asked, holding a handful of tiny lettuce plants, roots and all. We can. They did. That night they added the thinnings to their dinner, a small handful of baby greens, washed and dressed with a little vinegar and salt. They were small. They were barely a garnish, but they were fresh and green and alive, and they tasted like hope. By October, the greenhouse was producing steadily. Constance harvested lettuce every few days, picking the outer leaves carefully and leaving the centers to continue growing. A cut-and-come-again method that provided continuous harvest without killing the plants. The spinach was abundant, deep green and thick-leafed. The radishes were crisp and peppery, perfect slice thin and added to any meal. The carrots were coming along nicely, their feathery tops waving gently whenever someone walked past. Color had returned to Rosie's cheeks. The child had energy again, running and playing with copper, staying awake for stories at bedtime, asking questions constantly about everything she saw. Constance had started keeping records, not just temperature readings but observations. Which varieties produced best? Which locations in the greenhouse got the most light? How soil moisture affected germination rates? What techniques seemed to encourage faster growth? She was not just growing food. She was learning, documenting, creating knowledge that could be shared. The first hard test came in late November. Temperatures dropped rapidly over 3 days, falling from the mid-30s to well below zero. The wind picked up, howling across the plains with nothing to stop it, driving snow horizontally and reducing visibility to a few dozen feet. Constance checked the greenhouse every few hours. On the first day of the cold snap, with outside temperatures at 15 below zero and winds gusting to 40 miles per hour, the greenhouse held at 51 degrees. On the second day, when the temperature dropped to 25 below and the wind never stopped, the greenhouse dipped to 48 degrees. On the third day, the coldest day, when old-timers said the air itself felt like knives, the greenhouse stabilized at 46 degrees. Cold for the plants. Some of the lettuce leaves showed frost damage at the tips. A few spinach plants wilted and did not recover, but the rest survived. The greenhouse worked. Constance stood in the growing space, surrounded by green life, while the world outside tried its best to kill everything, and allowed herself to feel something she had not felt since Josiah died: pride. At the trading post, Thaddeus Hartwell was telling everyone that the Whitfield greenhouse would not survive January. "She got lucky with that cold snap," he said to anyone who would listen. "November is nothing. Wait until the real cold comes. Wait until we get 2 weeks of 30 below. That glass will crack like river ice, and all her pretty vegetables will freeze solid." Silas Brennan nodded along, adding his own comments whenever the conversation flagged. "She will be ready to sell by February. I will give her fair price for the land. More than fair, considering what she has put it through." Boone Tanner had raised his bet to $15, confident that he would be collecting from Harriet Coleman before spring. Only a few people stayed quiet. Old Jedediah, who had seen the greenhouse and knew what he was looking at. Harriet Coleman, who kept her own counsel and watched the sky with knowing eyes. And Verity Brennan, Silas's daughter-in-law, who was 6 months pregnant now and increasingly pale, who had taken to walking past the Whitfield claim whenever she could find an excuse, who had asked Constance once, quietly, whether the vegetables in her greenhouse were really as good as people said. December came. Christmas passed quietly. Constance and Rosie alone in their cabin with Copper sleeping by the fire, the greenhouse below them holding steady against the cold. On Christmas Day, Constance harvested a full salad, lettuce and spinach and radish slices, dressed with oil and vinegar, served alongside the salt pork and beans that were still their staple diet. Rosie ate every bite. "This is better than cake," she announced. "Better than cake. Better than anything." Constance smiled. "I think so too. What you are about to hear changed everything, not just for Constance, but for an entire community that had mocked her, doubted her, and bet against her. If you have ever felt vindicated after being doubted, you know how powerful that feeling is. Stay with me. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and keep watching. January arrived with a vengeance. The old-timers called it an Arctic outbreak, a massive dome of cold air pushing down from Canada, settling over the northern plains like a malevolent spirit that refused to leave. Temperatures dropped not by degrees but by dozens of degrees, falling and falling until the numbers stopped making sense, and the world became a place designed to kill everything in it. Old Jedediah had seen it coming. He had stood on his porch 2 days before the cold arrived, watching the sky with eyes that had witnessed 7 decades of Montana weather, and he had shaken his head slowly. This color, he had told Constance when she passed by on her way to the trading post. I know this color. I saw it in 1831 when I was a boy. The sky went this color, and then the cold came, and 40 people died in 3 counties. He had looked at her with an intensity that bordered on fear. Get your firewood inside, all of it, and do not go outside for any reason once it starts. She had taken his advice. January 15th, the cold snap began. Morning temperature, 10 degrees above zero. Cold, but manageable. The kind of cold that frontier people dealt with every winter. Layering on clothes and keeping the fires high, and accepting that life would be uncomfortable until spring. Afternoon temperature, 5 below zero. The wind picked up, a steady howl from the northwest that found every crack in every wall and drove needles of cold into places that should have been protected. Evening temperature, 20 below zero. Snow began to fall, not the gentle, silent snow of Christmas cards, but something harder, meaner. Tiny crystals of ice driven sideways by a wind that had picked up to 40 miles per hour and showed no signs of stopping. Constance checked the greenhouse. 54 degrees. The plants were fine. The thermal mass was doing its work, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the darkening hours. She checked on Rosie, made sure the fire was built up high with enough wood to last through the night, made sure copper was inside, and the doors were sealed with rags stuffed in every gap. She went to bed, but sleep did not come easy. The wind screamed against the cabin walls like a living thing, hungry and angry, searching for any way inside. She woke to a sound like the world ending. Wind. Not ordinary wind, but something else. Something that sounded like 1,000 trains arriving simultaneously. Like every storm that had ever been gathering its strength for this one assault. Constance stumbled out of bed, grabbed Rosie, grabbed Copper by the collar, and huddled in the center of the cabin while the walls groaned, and the windows rattled, and the fire in the stove guttered and nearly died from the draft. The thermometer on the wall read 10 degrees. Inside the cabin, morning came gray and howling. Constance forced open the door against the wind and saw a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls, piling to the window sills on the north side. The wood pile was buried. The outhouse was completely invisible. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 42 degrees below zero. She had never seen a number like that, had never imagined a number like that. She closed the door and went to check the greenhouse. The stairs were slippery with condensation that had frozen into a thin layer of ice. Constance descended carefully, lantern in one hand, the other gripping the rough wood rail she had installed for exactly this situation. At the bottom, she stopped. The glass wall was intact, frosted on the outside, slightly fogged on the inside, but intact. No cracks. No breaks. The frames she had installed with such care were holding. Inside, the temperature read 51 degrees. Outside, it was 42 below zero, a 93-degree differential. The space beneath her cabin, insulated by earth and glass and thermal mass, and the heat seeping down from the floor above, was 93 degrees warmer than the air that was trying to kill everything it touched. The plants were fine, a little droopy, stressed by the unusual cold, but alive, growing, green. Constance sat down on the cold earth and laughed. She laughed until tears ran down her cheeks, until her sides ached, until Copper came down the stairs to check on her and licked her face with concern. She was not crying from sadness. She was crying because she had won. But victory, she would learn, was never complete, never final, never without cost. On the 5th day of the cold snap, Rosie woke with a fever. It started as a cough, dry and persistent. By midday, the child was burning hot to the touch, her small body shaking with chills even beneath 3 quilts, and with copper pressed against her side. By evening, she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Constance sat beside the bed, her hand on Rosie's forehead, and felt fear unlike anything she had known since the day they brought Josiah's body home. The nearest doctor was 3 days away in good weather. In this storm, he might as well have been on the moon. "Mama," Rosie whispered, her voice thin and reedy, "I am cold." "I know, sweetheart, I know." Constance did the only thing she could do. She kept the fire high. She wrapped Rosie in every blanket they owned. She boiled water for steam and held the child close when the coughing fits came. And she went down to the greenhouse. In the warm green space beneath the floor, she harvested spinach, the darkest, greenest leaves, the ones packed with iron and vitamins. She pulled carrots, still small but sweet. She gathered lettuce and radishes and herbs. Back in the cabin, she made soup, vegetable broth, rich and warm, flavored with the herbs from her grandmother's seeds. She spooned it carefully between Rosie's cracked lips, drop by drop, willing the nutrition to work its way into her daughter's weakened body. Copper refused to leave Rosie's side. The dog lay pressed against the child all night, providing warmth that no blanket could match, occasionally lifting his head to lick Rosie's face as if checking that she was still breathing. On the 6th day, the fever broke. Constance woke to find Rosie's forehead cool and damp, the dangerous heat finally fading. The child's eyes, when they opened, were clear again. "Mama," Rosie said weakly, "can I have more soup?" Constance wept with relief. "You can have all the soup you want," she said, her voice breaking. "All the soup in the world." The fresh vegetables had done what salt pork and dried beans never could. They had given Rosie's body what it needed to fight. The greenhouse had not just provided food, it had saved her daughter's life. The cold snap lasted 9 days. 9 days of temperatures that never rose above 20 below zero. 9 days of wind that never stopped howling. A constant shriek that invaded dreams and made it impossible to think clearly. 9 days of snow that piled higher and higher until the world was nothing but white and gray, and the endless assault of Arctic air that killed everything it touched. On the 2nd day, the Hartwell family's roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. The structure Thaddeus had built with his own hands, the structure he had been so proud of, gave way at 3 in the morning with a sound like thunder. The family barely escaped. They crowded into the corner of their cabin that remained intact, burning furniture for heat, unable to venture outside to reach their woodpile because the wind chill had dropped to 70 below zero and exposed skin froze in less than a minute. On the 3rd day, Boone Tanner ran out of firewood. He had not stocked enough for a cold snap of this magnitude. No one had. He had calculated his needs based on normal winters, and this winter was anything but normal. He began burning his chairs, his table, the frame of his bed. By the 4th day, he was breaking apart the walls of his own shed, carrying the boards inside piece by piece, feeding them to a fire that consumed everything he owned, but could not keep the cold at bay. On the 4th day, Silas Brennan's store lost its north wall to a gust of wind that exceeded 90 miles per hour. The wall did not collapse gradually. It simply vanished, torn away in an instant, taking half his inventory with it. Flour barrels and canned goods and bolts of fabric disappeared into the white hell of the storm, never to be seen again. He and his family retreated to the back room, the only part of the structure still intact, sharing body heat under every blanket they owned, their breath forming clouds that froze to the ceiling above them. On the 5th day, word spread through the settlement that Prudence Whitmore's husband had lost 3 fingers to frostbite. He had gone outside to check on his animals, a quick trip that should have taken 5 minutes. He got disoriented in the whiteout, lost track of which direction led back to safety, wandered for nearly an hour before his wife found him by following the sound of his screams. By then, the damage was done. His fingers were black, dead, beyond any medicine's ability to save. On the sixth day, Old Man Patterson died. Not the one who had died in February from the frozen root cellar. His brother Harold, who had survived 60 winters on the frontier and thought he knew everything there was to know about cold weather. But no one knew anything about cold like this. The temperature in his cabin had dropped below freezing despite the fire burning in his stove, and the cold had come through the gaps in his walls like a living thing, found him in his sleep, and taken him without giving him a chance to fight back. His wife found him frozen in the morning, eyes open, expression peaceful, ice crystals forming on his eyelashes. On the seventh day, Verity Brennan collapsed. She was 7 months pregnant. She had been pale for weeks, tired in a way that went beyond normal pregnancy fatigue. The cold, the stress, the inadequate diet of preserved food and salt meat had pushed her body beyond what it could sustain. When Dr. Finch finally made it through the snow to examine her, his face went gray. "She needs fresh food," he said to Silas. "Fresh vegetables, greens, something with iron, something with vitamins." "Where would I get fresh vegetables in January?" Silas demanded. Dr. Finch did not answer, but his eyes slid away from Silas's face, toward the window, toward the direction of the Whitfield claim. On the eighth day, Silas Brennan appeared at Constance's door. He was alone, covered in snow that had already begun to freeze to his coat. His beard was a mass of ice crystals, his eyebrows white with frost, his nose the alarming red-purple of skin that had been too cold for too long. His eyes were red from cold and exhaustion and something else, something that looked almost like desperation. He stood in the doorway, not asking to come in, not speaking, just standing there as the wind tried to push past him into the warmth of the cabin. Constance looked at the man who had mocked her at the trading post, who had told everyone she would fail, who had tried to buy her land for a fraction of its worth, circling like a vulture waiting for her to collapse, who had laughed when Boone Tanner placed his bet, laughed and said she would be begging him to take her property off her hands before the snow melted. She looked at him, and she waited. The silence stretched. The wind howled. Somewhere inside, Copper growled softly, sensing that this visitor brought complicated emotions. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, cracked and rough from the cold, Silas spoke. "My daughter-in-law is dying." The words hung in the frozen air between them. "The doctor says she needs fresh vegetables. She has been sick for weeks, pale, weak. The baby inside her is taking everything she has, and there is nothing left. She needs greens. She needs iron. She needs something other than salt pork and dried beans." Silas swallowed hard, and Constance saw the muscles of his jaw working, saw the effort it took for him to form the next words. "I heard you have vegetables." He could not meet her eyes. This proud man, this man who had built an empire of commerce in the wilderness, who had never asked anyone for anything, because he had always been the one with the power to give or withhold. Now he stood at a widow's door, begging. "I know what I said about you," he continued, the words tumbling out faster now, as if he needed to confess everything before his courage failed. "I know what I did. I called you a fool. I said you would fail. I tried to take your land when you were at your weakest." He drew a shaking breath. "I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. And now my daughter-in-law is lying in a dark room, getting weaker by the hour, and the only thing that might save her is something I do not have and cannot buy." He raised his eyes finally, meeting Constance's gaze. "Please, one word, perhaps the hardest word a proud man can say." Rosie appeared at her mother's elbow, looking up at the frozen man in their doorway. Behind them, Copper had stopped growling, sensing something in the visitor's voice that spoke of genuine distress rather than threat. "Mama?" Rosie said quietly, her young eyes full of something that looked very much like wisdom. The baby has not done anything wrong. Constance looked down at her daughter, 5 years old. Wiser than most of the adults in the settlement, wiser perhaps than Constance herself, who felt the old anger stirring in her chest, the desire to close the door in this man's face and tell him that he was reaping what he had sowed. But that was not who she was. That was not who her grandmother had raised her to be. That was not who Josiah had loved. She looked back at Silas. "Come inside," she said. "Warm up. Then I will take you to the greenhouse." The greenhouse was warm and green and filled with growing things. Silas Brennan stepped through the angled glass door and stopped, unable to process what he was seeing. Plants, vegetables, life. In January, in Montana, under a widow's cabin. The air smelled of soil and green growth and something almost like spring. Impossibly, while the world outside was locked in the grip of a cold that had already killed 3 people. His eyes moved from bed to bed, taking in the neat rows of lettuce, the thick clusters of spinach, the feathery tops of carrots pushing up through dark earth. Steam rose gently from the soil where the composting manure below still generated its steady, patient heat. The black stones gleamed in the light of Constance's lantern, warm to the touch, radiating the energy they had stored from a sun that seemed impossibly far away now. "This is impossible," he whispered. Constance was already harvesting, spinach by the handful, dark green leaves that would have been worth their weight in gold at any trading post in the territory. Lettuce leaves, the biggest and greenest, snapped cleanly from their stems. Radishes pulled fresh from the soil, their red and white tips bright as jewels, their roots still trailing threads of dark earth. "Nothing is impossible," she said without looking up. "Some things are just difficult. Some things just require you to pay attention to what works instead of what everyone says should work." She filled a basket. More than enough for one person. More than enough for a family. Enough vitamins and minerals and life-giving nutrition to pull a weakened pregnant woman back from the edge of a darkness that had already claimed so many others. "Give this to Verity," she said, handing it to Silas. "There will be more tomorrow and the day after, as much as she needs until she is strong again." Silas took the basket with shaking hands. The vegetables were cold from the soil, but still somehow felt like warmth, like hope, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "How much?" Constance looked at him. "Nothing. I can pay." He fumbled at his coat. "Whatever you want. Name your price." "I know you can pay, but that is not why I am giving this to you." She met his eyes, and there was no anger in her gaze, no vengeance, no satisfaction at his humiliation. Just a calm certainty that transcended the petty grievances between them. "Your daughter-in-law is sick. Her baby needs its mother to be healthy. That matters more than any debt between us. That matters more than who was right and who was wrong. That matters more than anything you said or did or believed about me." Silas Brennan stood in the greenhouse, holding a basket of impossible vegetables, and for the first time since Constance had known him, he had nothing to say. His mouth opened and closed. His eyes were wet with something that might have been the cold, or might have been something else entirely. "Thank you," he finally managed. The words seemed inadequate, but they were all he had. "Go," Constance said gently, "quickly, before the food gets cold, and before your daughter-in-law gets weaker. There will be time for everything else later." The cold broke on the 9th day. Temperatures rose above zero for the first time in more than a week. The wind died down to something merely unpleasant rather than actively lethal. People emerged from their shelters, blinking in the weak winter sun, surveying the damage. 3 people dead across the settlement. Dozens of animals lost. Buildings damaged. Frostbite injuries that would leave scars for life. And one greenhouse standing untouched. full of green growing things. They came to her one by one, then in groups. Thaddeus Hartwell arrived first, his family behind him, their faces hollow with cold and hunger and humiliation. He stood at the entrance to the greenhouse, looking at the glass wall he had said would crack by December, and said nothing for a long time. Finally he spoke. "I was wrong." 3 words. Perhaps the hardest 3 words a proud man can say. "I have been building things for 30 years," he continued, "and I thought I knew everything worth knowing. I thought old ways were outdated and new ways were better, and anyone who disagreed was a fool." He met Constance's eyes. "You proved me wrong. I am sorry." Constance nodded slowly. "Thank you. Now bring your family inside. There is spinach and lettuce, and the first carrots are almost ready." Dr. Finch came the next day, his scientific instruments notably absent. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "My predictions were incorrect. Your thermal mass calculations appear to have been sound. Your understanding of solar gain was adequate." Constance was planting new seeds to replace those she had harvested. "Thank you, Doctor. Would you like some lettuce?" He would. He did. He took it home and ate it without another word about basic thermodynamics. Verity Brennan recovered. The fresh vegetables delivered daily by Silas himself, who never again spoke a mocking word about the widow or her greenhouse, brought the color back to her cheeks and the strength back to her body. Within 2 weeks, she was sitting up. Within a month, she was walking again. In March, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Josiah. When Constance heard, she had to sit down. Silas Brennan's daughter-in-law had named her son after Constance's dead husband. It was not a common name in the settlement. There was only one reason Verity would have chosen it. It was a tribute, an apology, a debt that could never be repaid in money, acknowledged in the only way that mattered. Constance wept when she heard, not from sadness, from something else entirely. "Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If it touched you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who refused to give up when everyone said they should, please share it. Leave a comment about what this story meant to you. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and remember, every time someone tells you that your idea is impossible, you have a choice. You can believe them, or you can prove them wrong. The decision is yours." Pastor Calloway never apologized directly, but the following Sunday, his sermon was about the wisdom of Solomon, who asked God for understanding rather than riches, who knew that knowledge was the greatest gift of all. He did not mention Constance by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. In the spring of 1848, Constance began teaching. It started with Thaddeus Hartwell asking questions. "How did you calculate the angle for the glass? What is the principle behind the thermal mass? Why black stones instead of white?" she answered. He listened. He asked more questions. Then Harriet Coleman brought her cousin, who was homesteading 40 miles to the north and had heard rumors of a greenhouse that produced vegetables in January. Then a man named Frederick Alderman rode 2 days from the territory to the east because someone had told him about a widow who knew old ways that worked better than new ways. Then more, and more, and more. By summer, Constance had helped 7 families design their own versions of the underground greenhouse. Each was different, adapted to specific cabin designs and local conditions. Some added more glass. Some incorporated cisterns for warmed water storage. One family built theirs entirely below ground level, creating a true pit greenhouse with just the glass showing above grade. She charged nothing for the knowledge. This was important. Knowledge that could save lives should not be hoarded. But she accepted payment for actual construction help, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. Enough to rebuild her savings. Enough to provide security. In autumn, a man arrived at her door wearing city clothes and carrying a leather satchel full of papers. His name was Howard Pemberton. He was a regional representative for the Sears and Roebuck Catalog Company. "We have heard about your greenhouse," he said. "We have heard that you have developed techniques that allow food production in conditions previously considered impossible." Constance invited him in for coffee. She showed him the greenhouse. She answered his questions with the same patience she had shown everyone who asked. When he left, he took detailed drawings, measurements, and notes. In exchange, he left a check for $15, more money than Constance had seen in one sum since Josiah died. "We would like to publish your design in our catalog," he explained, "for homesteaders across the frontier. With full credit to you, of course." Constance had one condition: credit the design to the techniques of Cornwall, she said. "Credit my grandmother Eleanor. She is the one who taught me everything I know." Pemberton agreed. The design appeared in the fall 1849 Sears and Roebuck catalog under the section titled Innovative Agricultural Solutions for the Progressive Homesteader. It included detailed measurements, a list of required materials, and notes on temperature management and ventilation. It credited the Cornwall pit greenhouse tradition and mentioned Constance May Whitfield by name as the woman who had adapted the technique for frontier conditions. The response was immediate. Letters arrived from territories Constance had never heard of, requests for clarification, reports of success. Thanks from families who had survived their first frontier winter because a widow in Montana had refused to accept that growing food in February was impossible. Copper died in the summer of 1854. He was 12 years old, ancient for a working dog, and he went peacefully. One morning he simply did not wake up. Constance found him beside the coal stove, curled in his usual spot, his eyes closed, his expression peaceful. She buried him beneath the apple tree she had planted the year before, in soil enriched by years of composted vegetables from the greenhouse. Rosie, now 12 years old herself, helped dig the grave. They did not say much. Some losses are too big for words. But that night, sitting in the greenhouse surrounded by green-growing things, Constance told Rosie stories about finding copper beside the trail, too small to survive on his own, about how he had learned to bring tools during construction, to herd Rosie away from danger, to sense when strangers meant harm and when they meant help. "He was a good dog," Rosie said finally. "He was the best dog," Constance agreed, "and we were lucky to have him." On a winter evening in December 1858, 11 years after Constance had first crawled beneath her cabin and discovered warmth where warmth should not exist, she sat on the stairs leading down into the expanded greenhouse. Rosie sat beside her. 16 years old now, tall and strong, with her father's steady hands and her mother's stubborn determination. She had taken over much of the greenhouse management, learning to read the subtle signs of plant stress and disease, to time plantings for continuous harvest, to calculate angles and temperatures with the same precision her mother had taught her. Outside, through the open door at the top of the stairs, snow fell steadily. Another Montana winter, settling in with its familiar weight of cold and darkness. But here, beneath the floor, it was warm and green and alive. The greenhouse had expanded over the years, now twice its original size, producing enough vegetables to feed not just their family, but several neighbors throughout the winter. "Mama," Rosie said quietly. "Yes, sweetheart." "Do you miss Papa?" It was a question Rosie asked sometimes, always seriously, always when something made her think of Josiah, the anniversary of his death, the sight of a man walking the way he had walked, the smell of fresh-cut timber. Every day, Constance said honestly, "But I think he would be proud of what we built here. He made a cabin to keep us safe. We made a garden to keep us fed. We are both doing what needs doing." Rosie nodded, satisfied with this answer. She leaned against her mother, and they sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of 11 years of work, 11 years of learning, 11 years of refusing to give up. Constance May Whitfield died in 1891 at the age of 72. She died in her sleep, in the cabin Josiah had built, in the bed they had shared during the brief happy years before the tree fell and everything changed. The winter had been mild that year, almost gentle by Montana standards, and Constance had spent her last day in the greenhouse, tending plants, teaching her great-granddaughter how to read the soil moisture by touch. Rosie was beside her at the end. 50 years old herself by then, a grandmother with silver in her hair and her mother's stubborn determination in every line of her face. She held Constance's hand as the old woman's breathing slowed, as the candle guttered, as the night grew quiet. "Mama," Rosie whispered, "I love you." Whether Constance heard, no one could say, but her face was peaceful, and her last breath came out in something that might have been a sigh of contentment. The greenhouse was still producing. After all those years, through all those winters, the techniques Constance had developed, refined, and shared had become second nature to a family that had grown across generations. The original structure had been expanded twice, rebuilt once after a particularly harsh winter, and improved with each passing decade. But more importantly, the knowledge had spread. The design published in the Sears and Roebuck catalog had reached homesteaders across the frontier. Letters still arrived occasionally, forwarded from the catalog company, from families who had built their own versions and wanted to share their gratitude or ask questions. Constance had answered everyone, even in her final years, sitting at the kitchen table with her reading glasses and her grandmother's journal, passing on knowledge that had been passed to her. Agricultural journals had published articles about pit greenhouses and thermal mass and passive solar heating, citing the Whitfield design as a pioneering example. Universities had sent researchers to study the structure, measuring temperatures and calculating efficiencies with instruments that would have seemed like magic to the young widow who had first crawled beneath her cabin with nothing but a lantern and a desperate idea. Scientists at Montana State University would eventually confirm what Constance had proven through trial and error half a century earlier. The numbers were impressive, the physics was sound, the design was elegant, but all of that was later. In the moment of her passing, there was only the quiet of a winter night, the warmth of a well-built cabin, and the knowledge that she had done what she set out to do. She had survived. She had provided. She had proved them all wrong, and she had done it not with anger or revenge, but with patience and persistence, and the quiet faith that knowledge, properly applied, was stronger than doubt. The greenhouse still stands. Not the original one. That collapsed in the 1920s when the cabin above it was finally abandoned, when the last of Constance's direct descendants moved away to cities where greenhouses were commercial enterprises and winters were something to be endured rather than conquered. The glass broke first, then the wooden frames rotted, and eventually the whole structure sank back into the earth from which it had risen. But the techniques it pioneered, the principles it proved, the knowledge it generated, these things cannot collapse. They live on in every seed catalog that mentions cold frame gardening. They survive in every extension service bulletin about season extension. They breathe in every basement greenhouse and every backyard cold frame, and every ambitious gardener who refuses to accept that winter means the end of growing things. Every winter, across the northern United States, people grow food in structures that trace their lineage back to a widow in Montana who refused to accept that February had to mean starvation. Every seed that sprouts in a pit greenhouse is a descendant of those first tiny lettuce seedlings that pushed up through the dark soil in 1847, reaching for light that should not have existed, growing in warmth that should not have been possible. Every family that eats fresh vegetables when snow covers the ground owes something to a woman named Constance May Whitfield, a woman who crawled beneath her own cabin one desperate February morning with nothing but a lantern and a hunch. A woman who discovered that warmth could exist in the coldest places, that life could flourish in the darkest times, that hope was not something you waited for, but something you built with your own two hands and your own stubborn will, and the memory of a grandmother who had refused to let winter win. They laughed at the widow's underground greenhouse. They called her crazy. They called her desperate. They bet money that she would fail until February came, until the cold came, until the only thing standing between life and death was a wall of glass and a woman who refused to give up. And then they learned what Constance May Whitfield had known all along, that the old ways are not outdated, they are simply forgotten. That knowledge passed from grandmother to granddaughter across generations is not primitive wisdom to be discarded. It is survival itself, encoded in memory and practice, and the patient observation of how the world actually works. That a woman alone, with nothing but determination and inherited knowledge, and the fierce love of a mother who will not let her child fade away, can build something that outlasts empires. They laughed, and then they remembered, and some of them are still remembering today. In 1978, researchers from Montana State University documented 17 surviving pit greenhouses in the Montana Territory that had been built using techniques derived from Constance Whitfield's original design. Temperature monitoring over 3 winter seasons confirmed that these structures maintain growing temperatures averaging 53 degrees Fahrenheit when outside temperatures drop below -30 degrees, validating the thermal mass and passive solar principles that Whitfield had applied through intuition and inherited knowledge more than a century earlier. The Whitfield design is now recognized as an early example of what modern architects call passive solar construction. The principles she discovered through desperation and determination and the memory of her grandmother's forcing house in Cornwall are now taught in agricultural extension courses and sustainability programs around the world. Sometimes the old ways are not outdated. Sometimes they are simply forgotten. And sometimes a widow in the wilderness has to remember them for everyone else.